The Love of Jesus Christ by St. Alphonsus de Ligouri. That's the name of the book, the chapter called Desolation. It is an illusion, since says St. Francis de Sales, to try to measure devotion by the consolations that we experience. True devotion on the way to God consists in having a resolute will to do all that is pleasing to God. God uses times of aridity to press his most beloved souls closer to him. What hinders true union with God is attachment to our disordered inclinations. When, therefore, God wants to draw souls to his perfect love, he tries to detach them from all affection for created goods. So first of all, he takes away from them temporal goods, worldly pleasures, possessions, honors, friends, relatives, and bodily health. By loss of such things, through disgust, disparagement, troubles, deaths, and illnesses, and infirmities, he gradually detaches the souls from all that is created to get them to place all their affections in him. Then, to make them fond of spiritual things, God at first lets them taste many consolations, with an abundance of tears and tenderness. As a result, souls seek to move away from sensual pleasures. Instead, they try to mortify themselves with penances, fasts, hair shirts, and disciplines. But here the director should keep these souls in check and not let them do mortifications, at least not all the ones they ask for, because people driven by intense fervor could easily ruin their health through indiscretion. This is a stratagem of the devil. When he sees that someone is giving himself to God and realizes that God is consoling the person with caresses usually given to beginners, the enemy seeks to make him lose his health through excessive penances. That way, when sickness comes, he will give up not just penances, but prayer, communion, all devout exercise, and return to his old way of life. For this reason, the director, when dealing with souls who have just begun a spiritual life and are looking for penances to do, should be very sparing in permitting them. The spiritual director should seek rather to exhort them to mortify themselves interiorly by patiently suffering affronts and adversity, by obeying superiors, by restraining the curiosity to see, to hear, and things like that. And the director should tell them that when they have gotten into the habit of practicing these inner mortifications, they will then be able to make themselves worthy of outer ones. Moreover, it is a terrible mistake to say, as some do, that external mortifications are of little or no use. No doubt inner mortification is more necessary for perfection, but that does not mean that outer mortifications are not needed too. St. Vincent de Paul declared that those who do not practice external mortifications will be mortified neither within or without. As St. John of the Cross added, that a director who despises mortification of the flesh should not be trusted, even if he could work miracles. But to get back to the point, when the souls first give themselves to God and taste the sweetness of the sensible consolations with which the Lord seeks to allure them and thus win them away from earthly pleasures, they begin breaking off their attachment to creatures and become attached to God. Still, this attachment is imperfect, since they are prompted more by feelings of spiritual consolation than by genuine will to do what is pleasing to God, and they deceive themselves by believing that the more pleasure they take in their devotions, the more they love God. Consequently, when they are kept from those exercises where they used to find pleasant pasture, and are employed in other works of obedience or charity or the duties of their state, they are disturbed and deeply distressed. This is a universal defect in our wretched human nature, that in everything we do, we seek our own gratification, or else, when we no longer find in our devout exercises the pleasure we tasted before, we either abandon them or at least cut back on them, and after reducing them from day to day, at last we drop them completely. And this misfortune befalls many souls who, when called by God to love Him, enter upon the path of perfection, and, as long as the spiritual sweetness lasts, make some progress. But when these sensations fade, they abandon everything and go back to their former ways. We must, however, be persuaded that the love of God and perfection do not consist in feeling tenderness and consolation, but in overcoming self-love, and in following the will of God. St. Francis de Sales says, God is just as lovable when He afflicts us as when He consoles us. When one is in a state of consolation, it takes no great virtue to forego sensual pleasures, and to endure affronts and adversity. A soul that is awash in the sweetness can endure anything, but such endurance often derives more from these sweet consolations than from strength of true love for God. And so the Lord, in order to give the soul a solid foundation in virtue, withdraws and takes away sensory pleasures, that He may rid the soul of all attachment to self-love, which feeds on such pleasures. And hence it happens that, although before this soul felt joy in making acts of self-sacrifice, of confidence, and of love, afterward, once the vein of consolation has dried up, the soul makes these acts with coldness and difficulty, and feels boredom in the most devout exercises, in prayer, spiritual reading, and communion. On the contrary, the soul finds nothing in them but darkness and fears, and all seems lost. The soul prays and prays again, and is grieved because God seems to refuse to hear. We come now to what we must do for our part. When the Lord in His mercy consoles us with loving visitations and makes us feel the presence of His grace, it is not good to reject these divine consolations as some false mystics would have us do. Let us receive them with gratitude, but let us beware of dwelling on them, to taste and enjoy the feeling of these tender spiritual delights. St. John of the Cross calls this attitude spiritual gluttony. It is a fault and displeasing to God. So let us care in such moments to expel from our mind any indulgence in this sweetness, and let us especially be aware of supposing that God gives us these favors because we are on better terms with Him than others. Such vain thinking would force God to withdraw Himself from us altogether and leave us in our wretchedness. At such times we must indeed thank Him fervently, because such spiritual consolations are great gifts from God to souls, far greater than all temporal riches and honors. But when they come, let us not seek delight in those pleasures of sense. Let us humble ourselves by recalling to mind the sins of our past life. We must consider this loving treatment purely and simply the result of God's goodness. Perhaps the Lord is comforting us with these joys by way of anticipation, so that later we may patiently suffer some great tribulation that He wishes to send us. And so let us offer ourselves up to suffer every pain, internal or external, that may come our way, every sickness, every persecution, every spiritual desolation, saying, My Lord, here I am. Do with me, and with what is mine, whatever you wish. Give me the grace to love you, and to carry out your will perfectly, and I ask no more. When souls are morally certain of being in the grace of God, although they may be deprived of both worldly and godly pleasures, still they are content with their state, knowing as they do that they love God and are loved by Him. But God wishes to see them more purified and stripped of all sensory enjoyment, in order to unite them entirely to himself by means of pure love. What does God do? He puts in them the crucible of desolation. He puts them in the crucible of desolation, which is a pain more bitter than the worst agony, internal or external, that a person can suffer. He deprives them of the knowledge that they are in the state of grace, and leaves them in darkness so thick that it seems the soul will never find God. Still worse, God will sometimes allow souls to be assaulted by violent sensual temptations, accompanied by evil impulses from their lower depths, or by thoughts of unbelief, despair, and even hatred of God. It will seem to them that the Lord has driven them off, and that He no longer hears their prayers. On the one hand, the suggestions of the devil have overwhelming power, and the person's concupiscence is excited, and on the other, the soul finds itself in deep darkness. As a result, even though the soul's will resists, it cannot clearly discern whether it is resisting the temptations as it should, or is giving in to them. This greatly increases the soul's fear that they have lost God, or that God has completely and rightly abandoned them because of their betraying Him in those struggles. Hence they seem to have already plunged into the depths of ruin, to love God no longer, and to be hated by Him. Saint Teresa tasted this pain to the fill, and the saint confesses that when she was in this state, solitude no longer consoled, but tormented her, while praying seemed to her a perfect hell. When this happens to souls that love God, they should not be dismayed, nor should their director become alarmed. Those sensual stirrings, those temptations against faith, those feelings of distrust, and those attacks that urge them to hate God, are fears, are torments of the soul, are efforts by the enemy. But they are not voluntary acts, and hence they are not sins. The soul that truly loves Jesus Christ does not resist and refuse such suggestions, but because of the encompassing darkness, the soul cannot clearly see. The soul remains confused, and because it feels abandoned by the presence of grace, the soul is fearful and dejected. But it soon becomes apparent that in these souls, put to the test by God, all is fright and misgivings, but not truth. Just ask them, even in their state of abandonment, whether they would knowingly commit one single deliberate venial sin. They will firmly reply that they are ready to suffer not one, but 1,000 deaths, rather than deliberately cause such displeasure to God. So we have to make a distinction. It is one thing to perform a good act, such as fending off temptation, trusting in God, loving God, and willing what God wills, and it is another thing to know that we are in fact performing that good act. The second serves for our enjoyment, but the profit lies in the first, that is, in actually doing good. God is satisfied with the first, and deprives the soul of the second, the consciousness of having done good, in order to take away all self-satisfaction, which really adds nothing to the merit of the action. The Lord seeks our advantage more than our satisfaction. St. John of the Cross wrote to console a soul in desolation, "You have never been in better condition than now.